Salutations and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today on the podcast we are so excited to present part 2 of our chat with internationally acclaimed author, practicing magician, and scholar, Dr. Stephen Skinner. Okay, first things are first. If you have not yet gotten a chance to listen to the first part of our conversation with Dr. Skinner, and because I can't make you and I can't bind you, let's just say I strongly encourage you to listen to that first part of our conversation. In that episode, we discussed the real relationship between scrying and magic, the carrot and the stick method of evocation, researching magical manuscripts, and so much more. Now, in this second part of our discussion, you definitely don't want to miss this because Dr. Skinner shares his thoughts on so many topics, including the actual size recommended for a magical circle by early sources, whether it's a 9-foot radius versus a 9-foot diameter. Dr. Skinner shares about proper pronunciation of words of power in a magical operation and what really matters there. And he also shares about building magical tension. He talks about this because it's a key element and an essential part of any invocation or evocation. Also, you, the listeners, get to hear Dr. Skinner share a story that's never been told before, which will definitely have you laughing, but also taking away key points about magical operations and what not to do. We also talk about ghost globes, and yes, even Apple computers and Steve Jobs are touched upon. Oh yes, you'll see exactly why, and so many more topics. Right now, this episode starts with a discussion of the relationship between magic and alchemy and a forthcoming update on one of Dr. Skinner's previous publications. Oh yes, some very exciting stuff. I know you'll all really enjoy it. And so now to help us uncork the uncommon in this second part of our conversation, I give you Dr. Stephen Skinner. That's actually a really interesting point about the delineation between alchemy and the grimoiric tradition. What are your thoughts, Dr. Skinner, on, I think it's volume 5 or 6 of your own source works of ceremonial magic when it comes to a grimoire like the Clavis Inferni, for example, which has alchemical symbols in it, or on some of the folios there's drawings of certain alchemical or elemental things. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, well, strange you should mention that because I've had quite a few thoughts on the Clavis Inferni recently, which I'm not going to entirely share with you because David and I are working on a much more full version of it, which will come out in a couple of years' time probably. But in the meantime, the symbols are not so much alchemical as from various encryption things which used alchemical symbols. There's a lot of alchemy in symbols, but not alchemy in the form of what to do. And I'm a what to do man, so I wasn't that interested in that. But I finally discovered that the date on that manuscript really should be 1797. I'd previously figured 1757, but now I've got conclusive evidence. I also now know where it came from, even down probably to the village that it came from. I still haven't figured out who the person was. But a colleague of mine has come across other work by him, and it has some very interesting connections, which are not alchemical, which I'm not going to spoil by telling you now. But when it finally comes out, it's something I wish I'd done when we produced the first book, but we didn't have access to that information. This is where research actually helps. On one side, it's spending lots of time in libraries and on learning languages that you didn't previously have. Several people have said, you should be able to read German so you could read the Faustian grimoires, and I'm afraid I'm never going to get around to doing German, and you really need that for the Faustian grimoires. In the meantime, one publisher, Nicholas, has started to publish the Faustian grimoires in English, so as far as I'm concerned, that's good enough for me. But it's, as it were, a completely different branch of the tree. And when he's finished translating them into English, then I'll have a look and get a little bit more closely acquainted with them. Yeah, so getting back to the clavis is actually Solomonic. And when we produced it, there was a lot of backlash because they said, oh, this is not the Clavis in Venice, this is not the Cyprian book as is found in northern Spain, and another lot of people said it's not the Cyprian book as is found in Scandinavia, and so on. And then I realized that there is a number of different traditions, all of which use St. Cyprian as their figurehead. And we never intended it to be either of those. It is completely Solomonic because it's predominantly Latin and doesn't have any relationship with the other two Cyprian traditions. It's just that St. Cyprian was famous because he was a magician before he was converted to being a Christian. Somewhere he must have written down his magic, but I'm not sure that any of those three groups have actually got what he wrote down way back when he lived in the Levant.
I know that all of the listeners will definitely make sure to be on the lookout for any future publications, especially that one. And I thought it was just such a great job by both of you because, as you mentioned, it is firmly in the Solomonic tradition. And even though some of the Latin is written completely backwards, I mean, large swaths of that text is taken from the Heptameron, correct? That a lot of the Latin is from there.
Absolutely. And it makes me question, why would anybody do this? Particularly, there were sections inside of sentences where the Latin was written backwards. I mean, it cannot have been a book that you could read from or even that you could evoke from. It was almost just annoying from that point of view. And the symbol sets, we identified crossing the river, which was used throughout it. But there's also a couple of other symbol sets, one of which Joseph Peterson kindly put us onto. But there's still a few symbols which we haven't interpreted, and the most irritating thing is the name of the author is written in a symbol set that I still don't know until such times as I discover what the symbol set is. Then maybe I can find who the author was and put that together with the geographic location and the correct dating, which has come my way recently. And then we could really say something about it.
Oh, yes, and I think listeners will be very, very interested in checking out that work. And Joseph Peterson mentioned on the podcast that he's working on the Ars Rabidmadar, the Proto-Grimoirem Verum text, and he mentioned he'd be looking at a few different publications and updates on that, which feeds right into Sepharasiel and the Heptameron, and it's just fascinating hearing your expertise and Joseph Peterson's about really connecting the dots and kind of expanding the web of connection between these grimoires.
And in fact, we're working on different areas, different spotlights on different grimoires inside the same area, and have to be careful we don't tread on each other's toes, because nobody wants to translate an entire Latin text and then find somebody else has done it as well, possibly even better. I think we're both aware of what we are respectively doing, and we're putting the pieces of the puzzle together, because magic in the West is effectively a broken science. The Catholic Church did a very good job at eradicating as much as possible, starting right back in the 4th century when they burned down various resources in Alexandria, and the Christians persecuted the pagans. I mean, paganism and magic are not the same, but they have substantial overlaps. Pagans could still understand the theory all behind magic anyway, whereas the Christians certainly didn't. They just said it's the work of the devil. It's like renaming pagan gods as demons,
yes,
or renaming 40 different magical techniques as spell or charm. So we're still doing the same bad things now as they were doing 2,000 years ago. So somebody needs to dig it out and put it into print. I think print is probably destined to last longer than digital form, because you look at stuff which used to be on the internet and it's not there. I know there's a couple of resources for looking at stuff that used to be there, but I think that parchments are still going to be here in 500 years' time, printed books a couple of 100 years' time, paperbacks another 50, 60 years, and digital, who knows, it can be turned off overnight if somebody decides to do so. Fortunately, I suppose it's a bit like blockchain technology. As so many people have got copies, it will survive. So from that point of view, digitizing all this stuff is good. And it is good that the libraries have finally decided, instead of keeping it close to their chests, that they will digitize it, even though they're sometimes very irritating and charging huge fees for the digital copy. or insisting you download it one page at a time. And one of my colleagues who is doing that and amalgamating the pages is really doing a great service for the rest of us.
Joseph Peterson mentioned he also on the podcast shared a story similar to yours where he was getting the runaround from some, I'm going to get it wrong, but some librarian or some official, and, just telling about the sometimes difficult task of you go somewhere, promise that you can view a book, and you find out the office is closing early or someone's leaving, and it just seems to create these unnecessary headaches for researchers such as yourselves.
Librarians are conflicted. Are we providing the information for everybody to read? The answer is usually no. Or are we keeping these manuscripts and books so that they will still be here in 200 years' time? And that's a very good reason, but sometimes that reason is used to overcome scholars like myself and Joseph who want to actually do work on the stuff. Talking about this, the British Library has recently opened its doors because the government has said we're spending money on you, so you've got to make everything available to everybody. And they started issuing readers' tickets much more easily, which is good news. But I'm sitting in the manuscript room and a couple come in and they say, we want to see John Dee's grimoire, we want to see John Dee's work. And the librarian says, what do you want to see? Which manuscript? Oh, we don't know. We just want to see it. What do you want to see? We want to touch it. We want to see that it's real. Oh, my God. So the librarian was very patient. And I think eventually called up one or two of Dee's stuff. And he stood around watching to make sure that they didn't pull their biro out and start annotating or something. And then after 4 or 5 minutes, they said thank you and left. So, I can understand librarians not wanting that sort of, because that ties up time, ties up manuscripts, and so forth. And in American libraries, and I don't know whether the same happens in English libraries, they have discovered one or two individuals who have not only stolen a lot of valuable stuff, but they go in there with a razor and remove illustrations and walk away with them. Because it's possible, so people do it, but that's a bit horrendous. So I can see why librarians could be a bit tight-assed about it.
In fact, Joseph Peterson mentioned, in addition to that, once you get past the librarian conflicted conundrum and you actually get in front of a tome and you're actually there looking at it, one of the things that he mentioned that was unexpected to me was, but logical when you think about it, is the handwriting. He said that one of the challenges is just going through the poor handwriting that the original authors might have had and figuring out how to really transcribe it properly. Is that something that you have dealt with too?
Paleography, it's a serious problem, but it's also a serious skill. That, for example, in Latin, there will be many, apart from the handwriting, in fact, the older the text is, quite often the clearer the handwriting is, the more precise. The guy will always write an I like an I and a J like a J and so forth. Whereas in stuff that's 200 or 300 years old, it can be sometimes really scribbly. And when I look at my own handwriting, God knows, I pity anybody who has to read that in times in the future. So there has been a loss of quality of the handwriting. What you've got to do is you've got to start transcribing as best you can until you get to familiar words, and then you go, oh, so that's a J. And then you write that down on a pad at the side, and then you go through the next couple of words and is that a K or is that an L? And so on. And very gradually, and then one of the things that I do, which is perhaps a bit crazy, is I try writing ordinary sentences using his way of writing.
Ah, that's fascinating.
Which sort of gets me into the head. And after a while, I've been looking at one grimoire, which is 40% boring Christian stuff, and then after you go past the 40%, suddenly there's real stuff. And I had several people help me and you do transcribe that and you transcribe that, and then between us we figured, hey, yeah, we know what that letter is now, and so on. And then I've been practicing using that handwriting to write my own stuff, and which is horrible. Now it's coming much clearer, so it does. But if you go back a bit further into the Latin texts, you're hit with the problem of Latin contractions. Because in Latin there's a highly inflected language, which means that all the nouns and verbs have got various endings on them. So the endings become standard, like, for example, um is a standard ending. Then in some of the old texts, a will be written as simply 5 vertical strokes. And you go, is that IUM? Is that IUN? What the hell is that? And these are called minims. And that is, the minims are a real curse when it comes to reading Latin, which has been, for its day, would have been well written, but it's a nightmare. So you get into the habit. And then the next curse is that the monks decided that all these minims were a pain, so they'd abbreviate them. So you'd have a word which would normally end in IUM, or just UM, and they would simply draw a bar over the last letter, and they don't bother writing the rest.
Oh my.
Or they'll draw a little hook that looks like a 9 up in the air, and that means something else. And then they started to abbreviate whole syllables, like per is a common syllable in Latin, and pro is a very common syllable in Latin. And so these are little squiggles, and you've got to know the difference between per and pro. Otherwise it looks like squiggle, a word, and then a bar. And you think, what the hell is that? But after a while it begins to come naturally, but it's hard work. Then you got the second hurdle, which is when you transcribe, you then got to translate. And then once you start translating, you realize this is nonsense, and you go back and you realize your transcription isn't right. So it's a long process. So one spends a lot of time, and I'm a little impatient. I'd sooner have the answers, but I realize that you've got to go through all this to get the answers. I was looking, for example, at Ars Notoria, which Turner translated, but translated very badly. The oldest text of that is full of all these contractions and things, and it's hard work. It's beautifully written. You know, if the letter is a K, it looks like a K every time, rather than with modern with handwriting that's more recent, it can look like an L or a B or a God knows what. So these are some of the problems, but I'm not having a gripe because it's all part of the rich pattern of working on this stuff.
Oh, yes, and I think you mentioned in a previous interview, Dr. Skinner, that some of the most beautiful ecclesiastical Latin-based grimoires are literally lying in facilities, sites, warehouses that have not yet been translated yet, and I assume those are the same documents that you're poring over right now.
There's an infamous warehouse where a lot of the books on magic and Freemasonry and sorcery and so forth were accumulated by Hitler during the Third Reich. And they're still just sitting there, possibly catalogued, but not open to the public.
Oh, wow. And no one's allowed in? Not even people of your caliber where you have academic and professional backgrounds? They just won't do it?
I suspect that some German-speaking scholars have managed to have access, but I don't speak German, so that's probably the end of that story for me. But, you just can't do everything. Like Joseph, I've got a list of books that I would like to do, which are either explanatory or exploratory or translational. And it sits on my wall here, and sometimes I don't do stuff in the right order, and then when I finish something, I cross it out. But it's still a very long list, so it's just not enough time in the day, which is also why I probably don't answer all of the emails sent to me, because there just isn't enough time in the day.
And Dr. Skinner, yes, to that end, we do have another question from Frater Ashen Chassan, who is inquiring, are there any specific classes or orders of spirits that have been the most helpful to you in your own work? And also, conversely, what spirits have been the most difficult to contact or work with as well?
I think I'd prefer to duck that question, if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem.
We've got to go a lot of detail there. The real answer is that I found individual spirits from different classes to be more amenable, and I've not yet figured out why.
That actually also, Dr. Skinner, leads to something that Aaron Leach brought up before about how one might start out approaching spirits as separate beings. One thinks of Astaroth versus, say, Astarte, but then evolving into seeing magical beings instead as part of a kind of continuum where attributes that might be opposite in nature could actually be embodied by the same being. Do you, Dr. Skinner, find that some spirits might be along some kind of magical continuum and maybe take on various attributes depending on the invocation or the rite?
This is a complicated question. You can think of spirits as belonging to different hordes, and I mean HORDES, or different teams. So, for example, in the Theurgia Goetia, you've got very clear distinctions that this particular prince will then rule the following group of spirits. So, amongst those spirits, choosing one by name, you might not always get the same one each time. That just sounds a bit confused. It's like the classic quote when some spirit was asked, he said, "Our name is Legion." He didn't literally mean I'm called Mr. Legion. He meant that we have many different names, and I could believe that the same spiritual entity could be called by a different name in a Muslim context as in a Christian context. So there's some fluidity there. However, once you've, as it were, caught and bound one, then the name that you've applied, or you thought you should apply to that spirit, will then continue to work. So you can call that one by name. But that's generally a fairly tricky concept, which still needs to be tied down.
People debate about the importance of the proper pronunciation of names and words of power. So I guess the question, Dr. Skinner, would be, if you're, say, working the Heptameron and you have Adonai Shaddai come up, well, is the effect of the on the spirit different if you mispronounce it? If you say Adonai Sadeh instead of Adonai Shaddai, or if you miss out on certain pronunciations, does it lessen the effect?
This is fairly straightforward. When people call me, they call me Stephen. In Malaysia, they call me Stefan. In Eastern Europe, sometimes Istvan. I respond to all of those because I know that it's really the same name. But if they call me some complete gobbledygook, then I wouldn't respond. So the spirits do have a certain amount of latitude in pronunciation. Obviously, if you can pronounce the words of power more accurately, you're more likely to have a better result. But having said that, who really knows what they are? You can ask a practicing rabbi for the exact pronunciation of the Jewish names, the Hebrew names, and you'll get a different pronunciation from the one shown in common use or in the grimoires now. Yeah, it'd be nice to be exactly right, and I would try to be exactly right every time. But even, again, taking the example of the Hebraic names, the Hebraic name pronounced by an Ashkenazi rabbi is completely different, well, not completely different, but it's a little bit different from the same name pronounced by a Sephardic rabbi. So if the people who still speak Hebrew on a day-to-day basis can't really agree on the pronunciation, what hope is there for the rest of us for whom, it's effectively a tool? So I just say go as close as you can. In the case of Hebrew, if you can find a version with the pointings, which is the little dots which indicate the vowels, it makes it much easier, because mostly Hebrew does not have vowel. It has 2 or 3 consonants which are used like vowels, like vav is used as a vowel, sometimes as a consonant. So you've just got to get used to which it will be. And I mean, that's why the Tetragrammaton has caused so much conflict. People will say it's Jehovah or it's Yahweh or there's any number of others. But the interesting thing is that when the Greeks came to spell it, they spelt it as I-A-O. So it's something like Yaol.
Yes.
And I wonder whether the Greeks didn't actually tie the pronunciation down better because they wrote with a language with vowels than the Hebrews who wrote without vowels. It's an acknowledged fact that current rabbis do not know the pronunciation of Tetragrammaton. So I throw that little bit of Greek hint into the mix for anybody who might find that useful.
We're just going to set the record straight right now because this talks about another hint, and it's a debate that people have about the size of circle that you use and the radius versus the diameter.
The usual interpretation these days is a 9-foot diameter circle. The oldest texts that I've been able to find talk about it as a 9-foot radius. Now, when you had angel magicians working in the 1700s or the 1600s, and they quite often were rich, they would have rooms big enough to hold an 18-foot circle. And yes, I have worked in an 18-foot circle. But for more modern houses, it's not realistic. My usual use now is a 12-foot circle. I don't think there's any particular magic in the numbers. I think it's really an indication. But if you want to go by the book, then it's got to be a 9-foot radius, which is just an indication that the terminology of geometry is not really English initially, but it's from Greek. But having done that, if you worked in a 9-foot diameter circle, as long as you didn't overlap the edges, I don't see any reason. No spirit is going to say, hey, you got the wrong size circle there, I'm not coming. It's not going to happen. So I don't think it needs to be made too much of a fuss about.
Speaking of circles, too, another big debate that I know you've weighed in on, and Aaron Leach and Frater Chassan, is when someone employs a circle, some authors, Joseph Liszewski and Ceremonial Magic and the Power of Evocation, insist that you really shouldn't use any kind of like carpet or anything like that, that you literally need to be connected to the ground, either on the concrete in a basement or in the woods. Can you talk about that in terms of should circles be connected specifically to the earth, or can you have, much like Frater Chassan, can you have a surface like a canvas or something on top?
Okay, so it's horses for courses. If you're invoking aerial spirits, there's no reason why you shouldn't do it on the top of a multi-story building, which I've done successfully in the past. If you're looking particularly at subterranean spirits or spirits that are more demonic in flavor, then Joseph Liszewski is right. And that being close to them in a cellar is a pretty good idea. The point about carpet is just a practical point. You cannot draw a circle on carpet with chalk, and if you do, there'll be many breaks in it. Therefore, carpet is a definite no-no. Floorboards, yes. Concrete, yes. In a cellar, yes. On a concrete flat roof, yes. Looking then back, if we check historically, the Egyptians said, according to which entity was being invoked, that standing on one of their flat roofs, because Egyptian buildings quite often had flat roofs, facing in the correct direction is an excellent place to invoke. And then there's a list of what spirits you might invoke there, what gods. But then in a different formula, they will say in a cellar, which is closed off or has only one entrance, which is closed and pitch dark and so forth. It's horses for courses, but you can't do it on carpet. And you do need to follow the lines with a sharp instrument afterwards. That's my personal take on it. I can't prove that from any text, but it seems to work. Can you do it painted on a canvas? And the answer is definitely yes. One of my first circles, which I painted with Graham Knight back in the early 70s, my first permanent circles anyway, was done on canvas. We painted it with, I think, acrylics, and that still does service to today, although I will, before operating, go over it again with a sharp blade. Not cutting it or even touching it, but passing over it in the same circular form.
I believe you mentioned at one point you were fortunate enough to have a property in France with a grove of trees. And are most of your circles and most of your operating space, is it indoors, or is it more of like when you were in France, is it like an outdoor setup? People vary on that. I don't know.
Both. I still have a place which I use for this, which has a very couple of very large indoor rooms on which I will unroll my canvas circle. But it also has a 30-foot long balcony with an oratory at the end, which I will use for exterior work as well. So both. But going back to the property I had in France, which had a beautiful grove of trees which are in a circular form already, the local farmer said they were that way because of the way that the initial tree had seeded in a circle and then died. But I'm not sure that's true. I always privately thought it was a fairy circle. It was very flat. There are a few roots that I just chopped out, and then I could actually inscribe the circle in the earth. There was no grass, and that worked remarkably well for a while. And unfortunately, we were far enough from the neighbors so that nobody could hear and nobody came looking to see what the noise was about. On one occasion on the same property, we were celebrating somebody's 40th birthday. We brought a band over and we had them playing more or less around the clock at full volume. and nobody complained, which is just a demonstration of how far we were from civilization. And being far from civilization is a good idea. Spirits do not like noise. They hate traffic. They hate smells. So in your average city location, all those things are present, and it just makes it a lot harder. Steve Sabda, I think, used an old warehouse at one stage. I've used various places, but this place in the country was very good because there was no interference from outside things. And my place in Malaysia is well out of the way as well. You make it hard for yourself to try to do it in the living room in a block of flats in the center of town. They don't want to come, and you want to make it comfortable for them. Hence the carrot. If you make life too difficult, they just won't turn up, or they won't give any sign that they've arrived. And that, of course, is the worst dilemma. If they've arrived and haven't given the sign, you don't really know what to do. A place in the country, you look at all of the standard things that Agrippa said in his 4th book, and it's dead right. You need to be away from humans, away from noise, away from interruption. And you don't want your relatives knocking on the door saying, "Are you all right? What's happening in there?" I never wish to have that. Which reminds me, can I tell you a funny story?
Oh, please, yes.
Back in the 60s, in one of my earlier operations, I had 3 colleagues, and we decided to do a 4-person invocation. Now, this bears on your question about should you have other people in the circle, which this anecdote will finish up by concluding no. Should you be isolated from everywhere? And the answer to that is yes. So we had a sound studio to do it in, which was brilliant because A, we could record the entire operation at high quality, B, we could hear no noise from outside, and C, we were guaranteed no interruption. Now, there was a couple of downsides. One of them was it had a highly efficient aircon system, so whenever we turned the incense on, it spiraled up in the air and got sucked out through the aircon vents. But, you got to live with these things. So now, we performed the operation, and one of the guys in the group, who is no longer with us, he's passed on, was a bit of a joker. And so after we'd done 95% of the operation, we built up quite a lot of tension. The tension was magical. There was also psychological tension because the 4 of us were fairly new at this sort of stuff. He'd recently been reading Alice Bailey, who he thought was a very tendentious, long-winded, pain-in-the-ass writer. Now, that's not necessarily my opinion of her, and I don't wish to offend anybody who venerates her writing. But you must admit that she's a bit long-winded and a little bit boring. So he'd been thinking about this, and we almost reached the climax. And he, being an idiot joker, intoned Alice Bailey in a very effective vibratory form. And the entire edifice of the ritual collapsed. Not physically, but the magical edifice. And we all broke out laughing because we knew what his opinion of Alice Bailey was, and we killed ourselves. And at which stage I said, "Look, you've just completely ruined the operation. We've been building up to this for weeks." And I was quite annoyed, actually.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
And the others were, "Oh, well, it's just him." And so we adjourned for the night and picked up the equipment and left and locked up the studio and went home. In the morning, I got an alarmed phone call from the guy who actually had the job of looking after the studio because of him we got to use the studio. And he said, "You will never guess what's happened." And I said, "What? Did we get the spirit we were calling?" No, nothing like that. But this morning, a crazy person arrived with a station wagon absolutely crammed with boxes of books. And those books were every single edition of Alice Bailey in every language she's ever published in every paperback or hardback edition. He arrived in front of the library next door. This is a university premises. I really shouldn't admit that we were using university premises, but we were. And demanded to see the head librarian and said, "I have come to donate these to the library." And the librarian said, "Well, what are they?" And he said, "Every single edition of Alice Bailey's wonderful work And this will be a great advantage to the university. And the librarians there trying to decline this. This is before the days when libraries actually declined donations. And he's getting more and more frenetic. In the end, he unloaded on the pavement, which was a common pavement for the sound studio and also for the library, got in his car and drove off. So the librarian had no choice. And I went, well, the magic worked, but it didn't work in the way we wanted. So there's a couple of lessons from this, that if you are building to a climax, you've got to keep going, and you've got to keep going with what you originally intended to do. Do not take an idiot into the circle who is going to suddenly do something like this. Good reason for not taking idiots into the circle. Before that, I thought he was a sensible lad, but his sense of humor overcame his feeling of awe for the magic. And then I realized that magic can easily have effects in the external world. Now, the effect was possibly by acting on the mind of this obviously slightly deranged person, but it resulted in a physical conclusion. And from that, I realized that quite often the spirits will actually work on other people to bring about the result, because they've got no hands. They can't do it themselves physically. So I learned quite a few lessons from that, but there you go, just a small anecdote.
Oh, I think, wow, I will literally never forget that story. That is absolutely hilarious. It is chilling to a certain effect, and it truly is a lesson. I just can't believe, I mean, my goodness, just uttering and intoning the name caused that entire shift in space-time and spiritual assistance and all of that for that person to drive up in a station wagon, was it? Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it was. The spirit being called was, in fact, Mercurial. And we all know that Mercury deals with books and things. And obviously it had arrived, and we had no knowledge of its arrival because we were all pretty amateur at it in those days. And it acted. And boy, did it act. Nobody ever told the librarian what had happened, but the four of us knew what had happened, and we kept it to ourselves. In fact, this may be the first time anybody has mentioned what happened in those days. At least one of the people who were there might actually hear this podcast, but the two of them will not. So let's move on to another topic.
What you just touched on leads into this other point, which is the importance of building magical tension. And you touch on this beautifully in the second volume of the Source Works of Ceremonial Magic series when you're talking about Rudd's 9 keys, and these invocations should be paced, they should be measured, and you say, quote, you need to build up the proper magical tension. And I remember reading that thinking, gosh, I wish I could ask Dr. Skinner what he means by the building up the tension. Is it basically a simple formula of the memorized invocation plus a relaxed state of consciousness on the operator plus, I mean, can you just give us, like, what are the elements that make up effectively building the magical tension specifically during a rite?
Okay, so let's just get rid of the idea that it's psychological tension. Obviously, there is psychological tension if you're performing anything, whether it's building a billy cart or making a cake. There's a certain amount of tension, but I'm not talking about that. The tension is that you are pulling an unwilling spirit from wherever spirits are, and I have no comment on that at the moment, to an unfamiliar environment, which is where you are, the physical earth. That is the tension. If your ritual is completely useless, then there'll be no tension because you won't have connected the spirit. And so you are drawing it in with both the threats of its superiors and also the niceness of the incense that you're burning. And when you burn the incense, you offer it to the spirit. Just as in a Hindu temple, incense is burned, but it's also offered to the gods and goddesses. And there's this strange little thing here that as far as I can make out, a spirit or a god or even a ghost cannot go around smelling or tasting things. It doesn't have that. But if it's offered to it, as in an offering, and I think this is the essence of making offerings, then it's accessible to them. And that goes for everything from the huge blood offerings in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem before 70 AD, right down to the simple offering of the blood of a mouse or beautiful incense appropriate to the spirit. So that's the tension. The tension is between you and the spirit that you're calling. And you build the tension, you make it almost inevitable that the spirit is going to arrive.
Okay.
So that's magical tension. At least that's as I see it. I'm not telling you anything from an ancient book or anything. I'm telling you something from my experience.
Can you talk about the pacing, too? Because especially when you're threatening a spirit, or at least trying to, as you say, play the part, there's so much energy, even in the state of the operator, where you start to feel elated, that I think there might be a tendency to rush, like tandem ruina flebilis miserabilis, and there's a tendency to rush things. Can you talk about what is the proper pacing?
Yeah. There's also the tendency to, let's get to the end of this.
Yes.
I'm tired of talking all this Latin, or I'm tired of talking all this English, or I'm tired of straining my brain. You have got to strain your brain. It's got to be deliberate. You've got to say the invocation knowing that it may not work the first time, or the second time, or the third time. And you've got to be comfortable with that you're going to be there maybe for the rest of the night. I mean, ideally you don't overlap the planetary hour that you've started the operation in. But if you run out the end of the planetary hour into another planetary hour, that's just too bad. You've got to keep going. Too many people gabble their way through it and then go, nothing happened, big disappointment, and then they go out and have a drink or something like that. Not to be done like that. It's got to be done on the basis that you know that it's going to come because you are pulling it, and it will get there, but it might take time. And some of the old grimoires say, what if the spirit is occupied somewhere else or is bound by another magician? Well, say before the year 2000, there weren't a lot of people calling spirits, maybe before 1990. I and other people are partly responsible for this. As some joker once said, some of these goetic spirits, it must be like the phone ringing off the hook all the time with a number of people calling them. And then the vision of that sort of interferes with me sometimes, but the point that you've got to take and make is that you are calling them now. And unless they've been bound by somebody considerably stronger than yourself, they will come. Now, there are even calls to the king that if the spirit is bound, to unbind him and let him come. And then there's more sophisticated ones if some other magician has bound that spirit. But generally, just the Goetia, you've got 72 spirits. In the other books of the Megaton, you've got literally hundreds of spirits. The chances of another one of those spirits being successfully called at the same time as you're calling them is pretty slight. I think the 16th century magicians who thought of what to do under those circumstances must have figured there's a lot more competition out there than there really is. The fact is that probably the best hour is the first hour of the day. So the first hour of the day is from the time of dawn for the first hour, because then everything is fresh. Everything is, if it's a Sunday, everything is solar. If it's a Monday, everything is lunar. You can do it again on the 8th hour, the 15th, etc., but it's not quite as fresh. So for us, the likes of us, for example, you're a night person, probably the idea of getting up half an hour before dawn is not appealing. And it certainly wasn't appealing to me either until I realized that it is actually one of the best times to invoke. The rest of the world is quiet.
Yes.
Strangely enough, the rest of the world is not thinking. If that makes any sense to you, if you're in a populated area, there is a lot of activity that isn't happening in the first hour after dawn. So it is more comfortable for the spirit and it is more efficient to call. So that's a minor hint.
I think that is absolutely fantastic. Thank you. And one of the things that you mentioned too, Dr. Skinner, is you don't need to apprehend every single word to perfection where you are literally reciting and understanding each sentence as it comes out of your mouth. That actually can slow you down. That you should, to claim the words, you can't just play a tape recorder in the middle of a circle. You need to recite the words or do them from memory, but you shouldn't get bogged down in the specific, meanings, like, I said Adonai in your head and I meant Adonai or something like that.
While you're doing it, you don't want to have the critical scholar looking over your shoulder criticizing your pronunciation. That is just bad news. No, all these sort of things should be done beforehand. And even if you got it wrong, you should be convinced that you got it right at the time. Or even if you made a really apparently bad mistake, maybe it was a pronunciation I should have used, after the ritual, you can sit down and do your post-mortem, but you don't want to do post-mortem while you're performing it. It's like an actor. He can't really go back and repeat his lines because he muffed them. He's just got to plow on, and you've got to plow on. Don't plow on fast. Plow on deliberately. Keep adding weight to the tension. Keep adding to it. If the spirit can resist me for 3 repetitions, when I call it the 4th time, it's just going to have to come. And by the 5th time, it has no choice. You know, this is your attitude. It's work. I've got to do the work. These things are not simple. You know, the things you can get out of magic are really fantastic. You can't get them in any other way. So you've got to be prepared to do the work. These people who just want to do it on Saturday night after a few drinks, you know, they're not serious. I don't like people who are not serious. If you're into an art or a science, for God's sake, do it properly.
Yes, I think that's one of the things that I really respect about your work, and that's how exactly I approach it as well. I know, memorizing a lot of ecclesiastical Latin really has you foster a certain appreciation, a deep appreciation for not only the ritual itself and the rite, but as you mentioned, of all of those people who really came before, and especially in the 13, 14, 1500s, were in many ways risking their lives for just a shot at doing this.
Yes, if you had a privileged position like thee, for example, or Henry VII, and you're a ruler, you weren't going to be dragged off by the Inquisition, but in Europe you might have been. So yeah, we have a lot of liberty these days, which we shouldn't squander. We've got the liberty, so let's at least do the invocation properly, and then we've only got to blame ourselves if it doesn't work. But in the past, it must have been rather freaky. Nowadays, even if I'm in the middle of the countryside in France, well, usually nobody comes, but if they do come, it's not going to be the Inquisition, so it's not going to be fatal.
Exactly. And I think you mentioned in a previous podcast, I think the host was asking you about not a lot of people are interested in magic anymore because of suppression, and you kind of responded back, well, no, it's not really. Maybe 1,000 years ago it was repression, but in this day and age it's more of just a lack of interest and a scientific reductionism, which to me is so sad, because what your books and what your work has done is really restored a method and a technology that is so valuable.
Well, people have still got to do it, and
yes,
doing it is much harder than restoring it. Sometimes I think I'd sooner sit in the library and struggle with a manuscript than actually do it, but in the end, it's actually doing it that's the worthwhile thing. But you can't pass the doing it on. Although I have, as I already mentioned, tape recorded some of the operations. Which brings up a question. I see some people on Facebook suggesting that you could just tape record the whole ritual, set the tape going in your room of practice, and go and have dinner or something. It won't work. There's no traction. And for the spirit, there's no attraction. Somehow, just the mechanical or the electronic rendering of the words doesn't work. I haven't really figured out why, but they have to be delivered by a human being. And the other thing that I've observed in some of the operations is that tape recorders, certainly the ones they had in the early 70s, used to malfunction in the magical environment very frequently. They would work perfectly well to record stuff off the CD, well, there would have been 33s in those days. You put them in a magical environment, turn them on, connect them to the power, and in the morning or afterwards, the tape is blank. These were reel-to-reel tapes in those days. So, but that's just a curiosity. I never quite knew. I always thought it was probably my inefficiency when it came to what in those days was high-tech. Isn't anymore, of course.
There is something that is fascinating, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's either in your techniques of Solomonic magic or the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, and I can't remember which one. But there is this interesting connection in my mind between, like, you call magic, or at least as you say, fooling the spirits with a crown, a sword, and all of that I think you call it the greatest ruse or the highest ruse or something. And I think of playing the part. I think of being like an actor. I think of you quoting Shakespeare and a stage play and this great drama, except the drama is actually real. Like, have you ever felt that kind of connection where there is this kind of cosmic play that's going on when you're engaging in this?
Well, I know that when you're invoking or evoking, there's a clear distinction between just starting out and when you feel you've actually got traction. You know that it's like, what was it, Mr. T? I love it when a plan comes together. Well, I love it when the traction begins to move, but I can't actually put my finger on exactly what that is. Incidentally, you quote me much better than I could ever quote myself. Half of these things, I couldn't remember where they came from.
You could ask my wife. Usually there's always a Dr. Skinner book or, Frater Chassan or one of Aaron Leach's tomes. But yes, I guess that kind of leaves one of the questions that a lot of people ask, which you've responded to and Frater Ashen Chassan has, which is, well, okay, and this is a total Mephistopheles devil's advocate position. I don't hold it, but people say, well, look, if this is all as scientific as you say it is, then, why not put a really good magician, a really prominent magician in a super lab where there can be no power outage, there's 25 cameras filming the whole thing, and put it all on YouTube or something. And Frater Chassan mentioned, I think he wrote in a blog post, that it just doesn't work like that. I mean, you're trying to render in 3 dimensions a being or a spirit that is beyond dimensionality. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, if people come up to you and they say, well, come on, Dr. Skinner, why, if it's so scientific, where's the video,
Yeah, well, these things have occurred to me frequently. I mean, for example, the sound lab that I told you about, I mean, we definitely recorded every single word of the operation, including the last unfortunate invocation. And I've several times been offered by serious research setups, can we do this? And I say, well, what do you need a camera? You need a cameraman outside the circle? This is not going to work. I've had people also ask the question, well, what about other people in the same house? Well, normally I don't do invocations in a building where there are other people, so I don't have an answer to that. Frater Ashen Chassan is right that somehow the falseness of the atmosphere, it's just not going to work. Now, this sounds like a cop-out, and sometimes I think, well, maybe it is a cop-out, but maybe one day somebody will figure out how to do this, but I haven't figured out how to do it. And anyway, you know what? If it goes up on YouTube, everybody would say, oh, it's been fixed, it's been...
Exactly.
It's been photoshopped. I mean, I've had several photographs of interesting things, and the reaction, still photographs, untouched up. The reaction when put up on Facebook is, oh, it's a shadow from over the other side, it's a this, it's a that, and I realize myself that I can think of 5 or 6 different explanations, except for the one that I happen to know is right. Let me tell you one of the most interesting ideas. Have you heard of ghost globes?
Ghost globes. I have heard of ghost globes, but I'm not 100% familiar. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, okay. So people have had photographs in significant places like Dells or whatever, where there have been a couple of bright, look like light-colored balls floating in the air. The immediate reaction from everybody is, oh, it's a camera, it's another light source, it's a this, it's a that, whatever. So one of the reasons I live in Southeast Asia is that a lot of magical and religious stuff happens here. It is a pagan atmosphere. I'm married to a Hindu wife, so I see a lot of things that you don't see in Europe or America. And there's a lot of things that if I brought them to the attention of the Western world, people would just laugh and disbelieve. But ghost globes is one serious thing. Local Taoist magicians have a lot of respect for what they see as gwai or ghosts, and they're occasionally caught on film. And there's a certain amount of objectivity here because I have taken some of these shots and other people I know have taken some of these shots, and they've been in a temple, for example, with no other sources of light apart from, say, a couple of oil lamps and so forth. And you can see that they congregate in certain places. Like, for example, in one Chinese temple I was in, that most of the ghost globes actually hovered around the ghost altar. In Chinese temples, they've got altars to gods, etc., but they also have altars to ghosts because wandering ghosts and spirits, they encourage them to come. And you can see like 23, 30, whatever of these globes of different sizes and different intensities in this photograph. And it's a number of photographs.
Wow.
So I put them on my computer and I enlarge them as much as, and I take high resolution things. They're not just a flickering light reflection. They've got a structure inside. It's multicolored and it's a structure, and it's, I won't describe it at the moment. These cannot just be an accidental reflection from some light source that's not even apparent in the building. You also find them sometimes in tombs, and then you don't find them in your average household photograph, even in a darkened room. You don't find ghost globes, but they concentrate in places where you would expect ghosts to be. And so I see that they're definitely real. But if I were to put these on YouTube or something, people go, oh, no, it's all a faked up job. There's really no point in doing this, because the people who've experienced it and seen it for themselves know that they're very real. Incidentally, these globes are not visible to the naked eye. They only show up on high-quality photographs, which is why everybody says, oh, it must be a light reflection or something. So, and I've seen a lot of things like this, which the Western attitude is just, it's got to be a fake. I used to live near a Taoist temple, and they would have a medium there, and they make quite elaborate thrones for the medium, and they have assistants beside the medium. This is quite strong in Singapore. And when the medium is finally possessed, and I don't see possession as magic, it's something completely different, he will be possessed by one of the minor gods, and then he will do things which are truly amazing, like walk up a ladder of razor-sharp swords, which I've gone across and picked up a sword and felt it. You know, it's razor-sharp, and this medium's walked up there. There's no cuts and no blood on his feet. Done all sorts of things, some which, if I tell you, you just won't believe it all. So you can't bring this back to the West. So when I'm writing about stuff, I'm fairly conscious of being cautious in what I talk about. That's about it. I don't know where we started this particular conversation, but there's just a few things. The other thing about the Taoist magicians is they do have lineage. Maybe I don't believe they've got 36 generations of master-disciple, but that's only 36 times 20 or 40 years, so it's not that long. But they've definitely got a long, unbroken lineage, because nobody has had a vested interest in trying to kill the practice. There was no equivalent of the Inquisition. People were not in fear. People were in fear of sharing the information, that is true. Because it was a profession, the Chinese look upon it. They will usually have one or two formula for themselves. Not every formula, but just one or two. And this will be a family secret. And as they refer to it, this is our rice bowl. If we hand it out to everybody else, we break our rice bowl, we can no longer make money. And they make money, and they don't cheat people. If the person is unsatisfied with the outcome, they'll just give it back, because there's no interest in that. They want to do stuff. Because of this, the information is all there, some of it buried deep in hard-to-find Chinese manuscripts. Some of it was shared, for example, with Michael Tassasso when he knew one of the Taoist magicians in Taiwan. Some of it's still buried in private archives and things. A lot of it was destroyed during the so-called Cultural Revolution, when Mao decided that anything that was old needed to be destroyed. But a lot of the information got out to Taiwan, to Singapore, to Malaysia before that happened. So it's a living tradition. In the West, magic is a broken tradition. People like Joseph, myself, and Ashram Chosan are, as fast as we can, restoring the bits. But there will always be bits that are missing because of the persecution and so forth. So one of my side projects is looking at the same method being worked in the Chinese context, and seeing that there are some procedures in the Taoist magic which don't occur in the West, and then adding them to Western practice. And that has actually been helpful. But that's another story, which I don't want to get into here.
Actually, speaking of lost copies of things and the preservation of tradition, I did want to ask you, Dr. Skinner, about something you mentioned. You said, I'm going to tell you a secret, and I shouldn't, but you talked about the location in Egypt of where maybe some of these, one of the Roman emperors stored more of these magical papyri. I'm not going to ask you where that is. I know that you believe that you've located it, and I've no doubt you have located it. But my question is, since you mentioned that a few years ago, has there been any update? Are we getting any closer to maybe finding these magical papyri and finding wherever this Roman emperor hid them, actually uncovering them?
The short answer to that is no. And the reasons are sundry digging in public places is not approved of. And certainly digging under a military complex is certainly not approved of. I'm pretty sure that I have the position, but I don't have the access and I don't have the permission, and I'm never likely to get. And that's a bit sad. On the other hand, because Alexandria has got a very damp climate, it's possible that they've molded away. But they were definitely seen back slightly over 100 years ago, and the description matches up. So if they last until then, maybe they're still around. The cause was a Roman emperor declared that all magical papyri from the temples, which could be used against the ruling Romans, should be confiscated and collected and taken to Alexandria, which it was. And so some of the priests, because the priests were quite often magicians, because magic was not anti-religion, it was carried on inside the temples and outside the temples with suitable approval, took some of the papyri home or whatever, and in the greatest case buried them in a tomb. And that particular tomb, which was in Thebes, has provided the best quality Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. There are many hundreds of magical papyri, but the solid, if you like to say, grimoires containing multiple techniques all come from one tomb, which the people who dug it up sold it to a diplomat called Anastasi, who used to work as a diplomat in Cairo for both, I think, the Norwegians and the Swedes. And he gradually bought it up. And his collection he then sold at auction in Europe, so that depending on who bid highest, some of it went to Leiden, some of it went to London, some of it went to various other libraries. Fortunately, it's known virtually where all those bits have gone, and so they've been brought back together, not physically brought back together, but the transcripts of them and the copies of them brought back together. And most of them have been photographed, so that is good. So that's preserving them. But strangely, it all came from virtually, well, not all, but the most important ones came from just one tomb. So there's probably other tombs. But of course, the biggest collection would have been the one that the Roman emperors insisted were brought down to Alexandria. And if that could be found, that would be the works as it occurred. But nevertheless, a lot can be reconstructed from what Anastasia found in Thebes, or his Egyptian contacts found. And then in various other places around Egypt, they found other ones which provide supplementary information. Most of it was brought together by a guy called Prosendance in the early part of the 20th century. And he transcribed or copied the transcriptions of the original Greek, because although the Egyptians would have written in Demotic, the guy who did the transcriptions and things, it was all in Koine Greek, with occasional footnotes or side notes about the correct pronunciation, which he put in Coptic, because Coptic has got a wider range of vowels than Greek. And so one can be fairly certain about the pronunciation of the god names and the words of power, which is what I like. That is in some ways a lot more complete than the grimoires.
Something that's certainly been lost, and I know your work, and obviously looking at the Hygromantia too, you can really see I don't want to say degradation, but tracing, as you say, the line of transmission with a lot of these things, whether it's the god of the day, the god of the hour, and then tracing it up through the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, over to Rome, and into Europe. There is this kind of condensation that happens where things are just... Eventually, you're just left with a list of, okay, these are the angels of the day and the hour, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Whereas there would have been a separate angel thwarting a particular demon for every single hour in the week. And that's precise. When it comes to the key of Solomon, you get the archangels for the day, but you don't get much else. In fact, the key of Solomon does not have the registers of spirits The Goetia has the registers of spirits, but not the same spirits. So this is what I say about a broken tradition. Putting it together is a lot harder. But if one goes back to the Hygromantia, you've got much more detail than the Key of Solomon. You've got many more steps. You've got various prayers to almost the planet, and then the angel, and then the angel that will bind the demon, then the demon, then the spirit. And so you've got the sequence still, whereas Key of Solomon is a bit like, these are the invocations, and these are the names, and there you go. Whereas if you go right back to Greco-Egyptian, the gods of the hours and things, it's there, but the bottoms of a lot of the papyri have been torn off, so you've got them only for some days, which is terrific because you can use them on those days, but you've no idea what they are on the bits that are missing. But one of the things I did was, there are a number of different manuscripts of the Hygromantia, and I went through comparing the demon-angel lists, and I could see that in many of the cases, the demon-angel pair had been dropped an entire line, or risen up an entire line. It is not in sync from there on. So I moved them slightly by one line, as it were, and then suddenly they're in sync, and it makes a lot of sense. So from that, I've pulled out a final list, which is a lot more accurate than taking either one manuscript or another. This will form part of my practical book if I ever get it finished.
Given that there's so many incenses and different, say, kings of the four directions, each grimoire kind of has its own different take on that, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the Hygromantia really is one of those sources where if you are looking for at least an effective or a consistent incense of the day and a consistent list of certain angels or demons, that's a pretty consistent resource compared to a lot of the later grimoires.
Yeah, true. But it still needs rectifying across the 10 or 20 different manuscripts, some of which are good in one section but bad in another. It's quite extraordinary. I was hoping there would be one manuscript which had the works, but it doesn't. Ioannis Maratharkas has divided the whole thing into different sections, and then I've matched up which sections are best in which manuscript. And so that's what I'm working on at the moment.
That's one of the things that Joseph Peterson mentioned. One of my interests is, as we've discussed the Heptameron, and Joseph Peterson mentioned with the sigils, the actual, seals of the angels of the day, those are in the Heptameron and in the Munich handbook, but he says that they definitely probably have earlier sources, but we just haven't been able to trace those back. I think he mentioned that he traced one of them to a Byzantine exorcism manual where it does have very similar angelic seals, but that manual was from the 1700s, but maybe it had earlier roots, and there's all that guessing that goes on.
Yeah, there was one manual transcribed by, I think, Armand Dalat, which has got stuff in there. But, somewhere sitting in the library in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, there must be a lot more detail. But this is not easily accessible. I imagine that Turkish scholars are perhaps not that interested because they're primarily... No, I just don't think they're that interested. But it's there, but getting it. I mean, the fact that since digitization of manuscripts there's been such a rush of grimoire copies and things coming out, just proves that there's a lot there that hasn't been found yet. I mean, it would be very nice if somebody catalogued every manuscript across the world, but that's almost impossible because the naming of the manuscripts is a big problem. Like, for example, in the 16th century or 17th century, in manuscripts in the British Museum as it was then, the librarian would just look at it and it could quite easily be obviously a Key of Solomon, and he would just say in Latin, it's a book on magic. He'd give it some obscure title rather than digging out its exact title, because obviously magic's a lot of woo-woo stuff. It's like Victorian theology. I'm not interested in Victorian theology, but very few people are. But at some stage, somebody will want to study it properly. One of the major libraries in, I think it was New York, decided that nobody would ever want to read all this stuff. And so they would trash their collection of Victorian theology. Now, a friend of mine, Jim Baker, was the librarian there, so it's his story, not mine. He said that a number of skips turned up, and they started just throwing the books into the skips. with the intention of putting them in landfill where they'd be thoroughly destroyed. And he protested and said, well, why are you destroying these? These are still books. They still have value to somebody. You know, maybe Victorian theology is a load of rubbish, but somebody wants it. So he said, well, let me at least rescue some of the more important ones. And he starts leaning into the skip, picking them out. And the librarian said, you can't do that because our Articles of Association or whatever it was say that we cannot give any of our books away to people. We cannot sell any of our books, and we cannot donate any of our books. We must, in fact, keep our collection stable, as it were. And he's saying, well, why are you throwing all these out? Oh, no. These are redundant, and they're going to be buried, and therefore we haven't sold them, we haven't given them away, we haven't done anything else. And I'm shocked, and I'm sure that there are collections of magic which may suffer the same way at some time in the past or some time in the future. And he was aghast as well. He was forced to put them all back in the skip, and they duly dumped them and buried them. So they're well and truly rotten by now.
Oh, my goodness. That is, you know, when I hear your interviews, Dr. Skinner, and when I read your books, usually your words are incredibly motivating, very powerful, and they really are a reminder of the true fidelity to the technology. But when I hear stories like that, that is just so sad. And probably the saddest words that I've ever heard you say would be in an interview you did, I think it was a couple years ago, where you were talking about the history of when the Muslim invaders went in, I think it was into Egypt, and they took over the process of burning books or putting them in the bakehouses of Egypt. And I think you said, it was such a devastating phrase, it was like people cooked their food on the collective wisdom of the ancient Greek world. And I was just like, oh my gosh.
They cooked it for 6 months, shoveling it out as fast as they could. And that was the whole, I mean, Rome was pretty civilized, but Greece had the real background information in everything. Well, not everything, obviously not computer science, but, you know, it had it for plays, philosophy, Greek philosophy still is famous, still is taught, algebra, architecture, for all I know, food. It was just the Muslims invaded, and they didn't know what to do with all these literally warehouses full of papyri, and there's various different guesses, whether it was the 70,000 versus the 100,000, whatever. They're all guesses. So they wrote back to the Sultan or the ruler at the time and said, what do we do with this? And the answer was clear. Do all these books agree with what's in the Quran? And if they do, we don't need them. Do all these books contradict what's in the Quran? And if they do contradict, then you must destroy them. So either way, burn them. So they did. And you get some modern scholars saying that Islam preserved a lot of Greek wisdom by translating it into Arabic, which was then translated back into Latin, which then brought it back to us. But the fact is they destroyed, I don't know what percentage, but say they destroyed 95% and translated 5% into Arabic. That is not saving a culture, that is destroying a culture, and it's very sad. In modern times, the same religious impulse has been to destroy the competition. Now, I'm not criticizing Islam because Christianity did the same thing when it was 1400 years old, or even when it was 500 years old. It wanted to destroy the competition. There was no thought that there may be some virtue in books outside of your own religion. So yes, that's very sad. So, just changing the subject away from magic and away from religion, let me talk about computers for a minute. It reminds me that, I don't know whether it was actually Steve Jobs, but anyway, Apple produced a number of computers. I mean, I can remember the Apple II. I can remember one catching fire, actually. Obviously worked it too hard. I can remember the Apple III. And I can remember the Lisa. Now, most people haven't heard of the Lisa. It was a rather large, awkward-looking computer. But it had a fabulous software for designing and architecture and so forth. But it was lumpy and it was very expensive and it didn't sell very well. It was actually named after Jobs' girlfriend, Lisa. And so he moved on and he produced the Apple Mac. And the Apple Mac was fabulously successful. So he was left with thousands of Lisas. So what did he do? Did he send them to a third world country for free? Did he give them away? Did he knock the price down to $100? No. They got a landfill site and dumped thousands of liases in the landfill site and bulldozed earth over the top of them. And for all I know, they're still there. Now, that is not as criminal as doing it to books, because books actually, well, maybe people have got a different opinion, and obviously the Lisa would be no good now. If someone passed you a Lisa, you wouldn't want to use it, but it seems like the same mentality. It's no use to me, so I'm not going to let anybody have it at all. It's a very dog-in-the-manger attitude. With all due respect to Steve Jobs, who did lots of brilliant things.
Absolutely, and I don't know where this would fall on the spectrum. Clearly books is the most egregious, but I remember reading that a lot of the compositions of Johann Sebastian Bach were used as fish wrap, like he would compose these beautiful things, and now they're lost forever because they were used as food, or because he was so prolific that they would consider it scrap paper,
Yeah, well, I think that's happened on a number of occasions.
Dr. Skinner, I truly, if you want to talk about things that we're thankful for that we have, I know our listeners feel the same way. I can't thank you enough for your time, your contributions to this burgeoning field, and really restoring the method so that we all can be sincere and give it a really the best shot that we possibly can to work the method and further this. I have to ask you, as we begin to wrap up here, for all the listeners out there who want to either find more information about your books, about your own endeavors, I know obviously Golden Horde Press, but what are some other resources, or what are some other areas that you'd like to point people to if they want to find out more?
Well, if you're just talking about my books, then goldenhorde.com has most of them. In America, Llewellyn distributes them, and so you can find them on Amazon in America. You can also find them in a lot of book dealers who charge outrageous prices for them when they've gone slightly out of print. One or two are out of print now, but I'm trying to have that rectified and get Golden Horde to do that. But if you mean other people's resources, then definitely Joseph's work, Frater Ash and Jason's work need to be read, because they're complementary. They're certainly not contradictory to the stuff I've been doing. And you also need to read back a little bit and read some of the older stuff. But most of all, you need to be serious about it. If you want to be an armchair magician, that's fine. That's quite a fun thing to be. But if you're serious about magic, then you need to do it, and you need to do it properly. You don't need to go in there with a kitchen knife and a few other things. You need to have stuff properly consecrated and purified. Just think about a modern laboratory. You wouldn't be doing research into, disease or food technology or something with dirty hands in dirty plates. You would want to have everything sterile and clean. And in some ways, the traditional magical attitude to the equipment of magic is that it should be spiritually sterile and clean, and also physically sterile and clean. And this sort of disagrees with the old-fashioned Christian view that everything magic is dirty, or it's quite the contrary. You have got to retain your purity. Now, by that, I don't mean living like a monk. It's sufficient to live like a monk for the 3 days before an operation and retain that sort of cleanliness. Even Egyptian priests, they would have 3 months at a time off, and they would go and live with their village, in the village with their family. And they didn't need to retain spiritual sanctity or cleanliness then. And they would go back to the temple, prepare themselves, re-enter the temple, do magic in the temple. It is a great technology. It's not perceived by everybody as a technology yet, but that's how I like to think about it. So best wishes in your work and researches.
Dr. Stephen Skinner, we cannot thank you enough, and thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the podcast today, and I hope to talk to you soon, and best luck as well to you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks particularly for asking sensible and to-the-point questions, which is always very welcome.
Wow, what a true honor and a magical treat to chat with Dr. Stephen Skinner. Now, of course, there were so many other things that I wanted to ask, but Dr. Skinner was already being so incredibly generous with his time. So I hope that both of us can find more time in the future to have another chat. And one of the biggest things that I walked away with after speaking with Dr. Skinner, aside from the veritable gold mine of information and just great insight, is the concepts and the force of motivation. It was a reminder to me that magic needs to be done properly, thoroughly, and it is hard work, but the results make everything worth it as a lifelong pursuit. And I also wanted to say thank you to you, the listeners. I have heard from so many intelligent, engaging, and awesome listeners like you, and I cannot tell you how much I enjoy bringing you awesome guests with so many more to come. In the meantime, definitely check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube. That's youtube.com/glitchbottle. And you can also download and listen to the podcast episodes on iTunes and on Spreaker.com and on Stitcher Radio. Please also make sure, if you'd like, to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. You can also follow us on Twitter at glitchbottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.